Well, hello everyone. My name is Gordon Hastie. I'm a researcher at the University of St Andrews. I'd like to welcome everybody to this Energy Innovation Emporium. Thank you very much for joining us. As you say, first off, you'll have gotten the joining instructions that this is going to be a recorded session, so anybody uncomfortable with that, I guess you can drop out now. For those of you new to these events, in the run-up to COP26, the Energy Technology Partnership and Research Innovation Scotland have been running this series of webinars to both inform the global energy community how Scottish research is helping to deliver carbon emission targets, and also to encourage collaborations between Scottish academia and wider parties. And this week, the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology Scotland, MASTS, is hosting the webinar. And we hope to give you a bit of an overview of the marine environmental science that's been carried out in Scotland. And in particular, we're going to hear from some of our early career researchers in MASTS, some of their perspectives, and discuss why we think this kind of research is critical for the development of the marine renewable energy industry. We have a fairly packed programme to fill our 90 minutes with a number of live and recorded presentations. To kick us off, we have Jared Wilson from Marine Scotland and Rianne Miller from Aquaterra. We're going to give us a bit of an introduction to the environmental aspects of the MRE industry in Scotland, and to some of the related environmental research initiatives and collaborations. We then have a scientific showcase section where the early career researchers from many of the MAST partners have provided a series of lightning talks on their research. Then I'm delighted to say that we'll be joined by Dan Hasselman from the Fundy Ocean Research Centre for Energy, who will be giving us his perspective on the importance of international collaborative research in the MRE industry. The final session will be from Ben Wilson from the Scottish Association for Marine Science, who's going to give us his thoughts on both where we are and perhaps more importantly, where we need to be with environmental science to inform the MRE industry. So I very much hope you enjoy these, and without further ado, I shall start some of these talks.
Hi, great to be here today. I'm Jared Wilson and I manage the Renewables and Energy Programme in the Science Division of the Scottish Government's Marine Directorate at Marine Scotland. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of environmental science in the delivery of marine renewables in Scotland. So Scotland, as I'm sure we're all aware, has significant renewable energy resources. It also has ambitious renewable energy generation targets to help achieve net zero and tackle the climate emergency. Scotland, we're also fortunate in supporting internationally important marine habitats and species, and the Scottish Government is committed to ensuring their sustainable management. There are also, of course, other users of the marine environment that play important economic and social roles, particularly in more isolated coastal areas and communities. So there are a range of government objectives and priorities that need to be delivered, and their delivery requires the establishment of sound policies, effective planning and efficient licensing and regulation. The decisions involved in all of these steps require reliable and accessible information informed by best available science. Decision-making simply cannot wait for perfect knowledge and must weigh up the relative strengths and weaknesses of the information or evidence that is available at that point in time. The process falls down when decisions are not made or decision timelines are extended indefinitely. The scale of future marine renewable development in Scotland is really quite substantial. This map highlights in blue the areas identified for potential offshore wind farms under the ScotWind leasing round, which is underway at present and is managed by the Crown Estate Scotland, with the results of that leasing round due, I think, in January 22. So ScotWind Leasing Round was informed by the Scottish Government's sectoral marine plan for offshore wind in Scotland, and this used, amongst other things, constraint mapping, which incorporated data on species distribution, relative sensitivity to particular marine activities, habitat presence, etc., to identify potentially suitable areas for offshore wind farm development. The sectoral marine plan also identified knowledge or data gaps that may constrain the decision-making process. We therefore face a range of challenges in the delivery of marine renewable energy in Scotland. As just mentioned, whilst we have substantial renewable energy resource, we also support important wildlife and habitats. There are other users of the marine environment, and the scale of renewables development is really quite large. Potential impacts of marine renewables on particularly birds and marine renewables have constrained development in the past. That's both tidal stream and offshore wind. There are significant logistical and financial costs of gathering data at sea. We're often interested in highly mobile marine species that can be very difficult to encounter. The events of interest may be very rare, but over time highly significant. For example, collisions with tidal stream turbines or offshore wind turbines, and even basic information on population size, distribution, or drivers of change may be unknown for many species. Cumulative and in combination impacts are also likely to be increasingly relevant. So Marine Scotland has long recognised these challenges and has been actively engaged in delivering or facilitating the delivery of environmental science that addresses key knowledge gaps, facing the sustainable delivery of marine renewables. To help with this, ScotMer, the Scottish Marine Energy Research Programme, was set up about 7 years ago as a mechanism for delivery. So identifying knowledge gaps and identifying opportunities for them to be addressed. Information on ScotMer can be found on the Marine Scotland website. I'm not going to go into detail here. And it's enabled Marine Scotland and others to more effectively address key knowledge gaps via a range of different mechanisms and approaches. Marine Scotland Science undertakes research itself. An example here is focusing on cetaceans and salmon smolt at sea to understand potential exposure and responses to construction and operation of marine renewables. So here we have the deployment of and retrieval of moorings with acoustic receivers to detect cetaceans or acoustically tagged fish. For this, we use the Marine Scotland research vessels, with the smaller of the two of these, the Alba and Amara, in the slide here. Outputs from this research is in the form of peer-reviewed papers, technical reports, layperson summaries, and critically updated advice to the regulator. There are also a number of collaborative projects that have been delivered or underway to address key knowledge gaps identified by ScotMer. The slide here illustrates underwater noise and cetacean monitoring moorings around Scotland, and actually since this map was produced, a few more have been added off the west coast of Hebrides. Such collaborations with other institutions in the UK and overseas are something that we're keen to continue, and be very interested in hearing from anyone who has ideas, suggestions for collaborations. I think it also illustrates how different projects can jointly deliver data sets and outcomes at a strategic level, and I think that's one of the advantages of Marine Scotland in this case being involved in multiple projects and being able to capitalise on the synergies between them. Once again, the outputs are in the form of peer-reviewed papers, technical reports, layperson summaries, and updated advice to the regulator. The ScotMore evidence maps have also increased our Marine Scotland's ability to access funding to commission research to address priority knowledge gaps. Listed here are some of the projects from the past few years. I'm not going to run through them. A large proportion of these projects have been undertaken by academic institutions. They tend not to be sort of cranking the handle projects, and so it's quite common for academics to be best placed to deliver on some of these projects. Outputs again are in the form of peer-reviewed papers, technical reports, also user-friendly tools that can be that are made available to statutory advisors, industry, and the regulator, and recommendations on how the outcomes of the work could be best applied in the provision of advice. ScotMore evidence maps have also allowed us and academic partners to identify PhD projects, project ideas, or PhDs, or postdocs with real-world end-user relevance, or to consider how PhDs or postdocs could help address some of these real-world issues. So we're involved in a range of doctoral training programs, for example, Super, Quadrat, and the Bryden Centre. And key here has definitely been early engagement with between academia, industry, government, and key stakeholders to understand the critical issues and knowledge gaps that may exist, appreciate the relative constraints that might be in play with the various organisations, and excuse me, think about how research outputs could be used in assessments or decision makers. And even minor changes to the way that information is presented in publications can have a very significant impact on if and how those outputs are used or cited. So early engagement really is critical there. There's also, of course, a significant role for industry to play in all of this, and industry has been playing a significant role in this to date. The data and information collected pre and post construction is often of direct relevance to future planning and licensing decisions, as well as delivering on an individual wind farm's license conditions. Collaboration across wind farm projects can deliver outcomes with broader applicability or in a more resource efficient manner. There's also huge potential for synergies with other activities or funding sources, with industry having opportunities to offer in-kind support to such initiatives. Effective communication is key to ensuring maximum gain from post-construction monitoring, and it really is the responsibility of all involved. For offshore wind in Scotland, the Moray Firth and the Forth and Tay Regional Advisory Group set up by Marine Scotland about 8 years ago have an important role to play in this. Well, that's all I had to say today, so thank you very much for your time. If anyone has any questions or you'd like to discuss anything further with me, I'm more than happy to be contacted via the email address here. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I'm Rayanne Miller from Liz Maston from UHI. I co-convene the MASTS Renewable Energy Forum. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person with you today, but I hope that I can at least provide a little bit of a virtual introduction to MASTS as well as to the Marine Renewable Energy Forum. I'll just say now that if there's anything you'd like to discuss in more detail, I'm sure my colleagues who are in attendance today can answer any questions you might have. But if you'd like to get in contact with Liz or I've also provided our contact details at the end of this presentation. So here we go. I'll start with a little bit of background about MASTS, or the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland. MASTS is a Scottish research pooling initiative that started in 2009, and its aim is to bring together Scotland's marine science research community. MASTS is funded both by the Scottish Funding Council and its member institutions, And its goal is really to strengthen the links across the entire marine science community in Scotland. And that includes not only academics, but also government organisations, NGOs, and industry. MASTS helps to enable excellent research, and it provides a real platform for informed and evidence-based marine policies, governance, and industry. At present, MASTS is made up of 17 member organisations, and these are really spread across the entire geography of Scotland. And all of these member institutions contribute financially to the consortium. So you can see here that these are a real mix of universities, government organisations like Marine Scotland, and other public bodies like Nature Scot, JNCC, and SEPA. Together, these organisations form a body of about 600 researchers from across the consortium. So you can see it's a real powerhouse of marine science research. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of where the Marine Renewable Energy Forum sits within MASTS, what I've set out here is the MASTS structure. So you can see we've kind of got the governing council and advisory committees, and kind of that's the overarching governing structure. But there's also a series of 3 different research themes. Now, the renewable energy theme sits within the Marine Renewable Energy Forum sits within the Productive Seas theme. And we sit there alongside the Oil and Gas Forum, the Fisheries Forum, and the Aquaculture Research Forum. Now, what I was going to do was try to highlight all of the different research forums across the 3 themes where our activities overlap, where we collaborate, we've hosted events together. But actually, it turns out it was nearly all of them. And so I couldn't highlight them here. It would have just been too much on the screen. But it's just important to note that many of our researchers work across different themes, and that really enables us to bring in new ideas from all sorts of different parts of the marine science community. So the Marine Renewable Energy Forum itself is very much focused on understanding the interactions between marine renewable energy developments and the marine environment. And just to note that this includes offshore wind, floating offshore wind, wave, and tidal energy developments. So when we were established way back in 2009, many of our forum members focused on research on single species, single impacts, but now collectively, now in 2021, much of our forum's work has really moved towards using an ecosystem approach to understanding the relationships between energy production and environmental change. We're also increasingly collaborating with researchers across different fields. So this includes engineers, social scientists, and economists. And we, as a forum, we support this through events and supporting other opportunities for networking and collaboration. And finally, we really know how important it is to collaborate with the end users of our work. This is the way that it will generate as much impact as possible. And for us, that's really government regulatory bodies and industry, both in the UK, but also internationally. And just to note that a number of business and government representatives sit on our forum steering group, and that really helps us to guide this work and make sure it's really impactful for those end users. So what do we do as a forum? The work that we engage in is broad, to do with the marine renewable energy field. And I won't talk about this too much in specifics, and that's because we've got a number of fantastic researchers here today who are going to tell you all about their work. But just to summarise, our forum's research really sits within 3 broad categories. That's environmental science, social science, and development of new monitoring technologies. I'll also emphasise again here the impact that our work has had over the years in supporting policymakers, regulators, SNCBs, and the industry to develop new marine renewable energy projects around the coast of Scotland. So with that, I'll hand it over to the organisers just to show a short animation that we commissioned this year, which describes the impact and importance of our forum's work and more generally of environmental science to marine renewable energy. I hope you enjoy the animation, and please don't hesitate to be in touch if you would like to know more about the forum, or if you think there might be ways that we can work together in the future. Thank you.
Climate change is a huge global challenge. Sometimes it can feel too big to solve, but we have many solutions already within reach. Our seas contain a huge amount of energy in the motion of the tides, its crashing waves, and force of the wind. Scotland's world-leading offshore renewable energy sector can harness this energy, making a big contribution to reducing our carbon emissions. As we develop this industry in Scotland, we create more jobs, transferring skills with other industries, and allow greater prosperity for many coastal communities. This is part of the Just Transition to Net Zero framework, tackling climate change without causing economic and social problems as we move away from fossil fuels. Wind, tidal and wave energy devices must share the sea with fishing boats, cargo ships, yachts, tourists and many other activities that are important for communities and businesses. We also need to leave space for nature and maintain a healthy marine environment. Scotland's marine scientists help us understand how to look after nature when developing renewable energy projects. They study the environmental effects of development such as the Moray Firth's wind farms and the Pentland Firth's tidal turbines, and shed light on how renewable energy can benefit communities and grow sustainably.
My research on seal behaviour around operating tidal turbine arrays is helping the renewable energy industry plan and implement effective measures to mitigate the potential negative environmental impact of their devices.
My research on seabirds in tidal stream environments helps the government and renewable energy developers assess impacts of tidal stream turbines on marine wildlife.
My research on the ecology of marine growth and biofouling on submerged infrastructure is helping marine renewable energy developers and engineers plan for the maintenance of operations of the MRE devices.
Offshore renewable energy is helping us take up the climate challenge. The Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland provides an open and collaborative space for this science-led approach. By teaming up with industry, engineers and people in government, scientists can help us achieve a marine environment that is sustainable, good for business, good for climate and good for people.
Great. Well, thank you to Rayanne and Jared for providing those talks. As they mentioned in the talks, unfortunately, they couldn't be here today. I see they've left their contact details if anyone wanted to get in touch with them. We now have a session from our early career researchers across MASTS, and luckily for us, most of them will be here today. So I'm hoping that afterwards we can have a short Q&A session with them all. So as we're going through the talks, please do think of any questions that you might have for them. Either drop them in the chat or afterwards just put up your hand. We can come to your question. Okay, thanks.
Hello everyone, my name is JiaBin Huang and I'm going to talk about some of the work myself, Nick Horn, Tierney Carter and Gordon Hasty have been doing to assess how animals move in areas where tidal turbines exist, or indeed where they're proposed, and how we can use real-world data to refine our estimates of the environmental impact of the devices, specifically how likely animals are to collide with the turbines. It's one of the biggest ecological concerns for the tidal energy industry, specifically those devices with exposed moving parts like tidal kites or cross-axis turbines, is marine animal collision resulting in mortality. So empirical data on collisions is very difficult to collect, so we rely on numerical and physical modelling to estimate the rate at which collisions could occur. And most recently, a simulation-based method of estimating collision risk has been developed by Nick Horn at Queen's University. And this offers many benefits from previous models of collision risk, including flexibility of parameters and an easily adaptable framework for the user. And it can produce plots like these you can see below, which show the probability of collision in different scenarios with differing seal speeds, different sizes of seals, different dive profiles, and different orientations, which are all simulated data that you can input to this model. However, these sort of models are currently really lacking in real-world data to refine these simulations and make them more applicable to real-world situations. So what we're seeking to do is provide this refinement using existing animal tracking data. We use GPS tags such as those you see on the neck of a harbour seal here, and time depth recorders which measure the animal's movement through the water column. And these tags then generate reasonably high two-dimensional movement data, which we can relate to environmental variables and human activity, such as tidal dynamics or the operational status of a turbine array, to assess the variation in animal movement when they're exposed to varying conditions. We can then summarize these data and use statistical modeling to predict how animals will behave around tidal energy devices and at different states of the tide, for example. So here we can see the direction which animals travelled in each of the delineated grid cells within the Pentland Firth on the north coast of Scotland. So from this we can predict the direction an animal might pass by or through a tidal turbine. And we can also use the information we have on the current movement to predict the orientation of the animal as it passes by the turbines. So we know effectively whether the animals are travelling headfirst in their observed movement direction, or if they're being advected backwards by the currents, which we see quite frequently in these really energetic areas. Similarly, we can look at the dive data and predict the proportion of time the animals spend in different areas of the water column, and predict the proportion of time an animal will spend in the zones of risk. Now, all this information can then be plugged into the collision risk models to provide us with a context-specific collision risk probability that allows us to more accurately assess how many animals we may expect to be affected by the installation of the devices. So thank you very much for listening to that very brief summary of the work we're doing, and if you're interested in knowing a bit more about the work, I'm happy to take any questions either now or using the contact details that are below. Thank you very much.
Good morning, my name is Denise Risch, and I would like to briefly present our recent work recording the acoustic signature of tidal turbines in the Pentland Firth. I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Nienke van Geel, Douglas Gillespie, and Ben Wilson. The study has been carried out in the Pentland Firth, a high-energy environment. These sites are often preferred habitat and foraging areas for marine mammals such as porpoises and seals, but have recently become sites of interest for the marine renewable energy industry also, due to the high potential power that may be harvested as we are moving away from fossil fuels. Thinking about potential interactions between this industry and marine mammals, we need to understand both animal behavior, but also we need to know about noise emissions of turbines and the variability of ambient sound in these sites to answer the question, how does turbine noise affect the local soundscape, and what are the wider implications for animal movement and the potential for masking? The Maiden project in the Pentland Firth started in 2016 as the largest tidal turbine project in the world. It is currently in the demonstration and environmental monitoring phase with 4 turbines of 2 different types installed. The site will be built out to a consented 80 megawatts, about 40 to 50 turbines, and in future it is envisaged that the site can support up to 398 megawatts. Working in tidal stream environments is challenging. In many tidal channels around Scotland, current speeds can be faster than 2 to 3 meters per second, and mooring hydrophones to the seabed is a logistical challenge in these areas. It also introduces flow noise that makes it difficult to accurately monitor and measure the lower frequencies in particular. To monitor under these conditions, Caroline Carter and Ben Wilson and others have developed drifting hydrophones, which consist of a drogue with a suspended recorder and hydrophone inside it, a surface float and satellite unit attached to it to track devices and provide accurate spatial information in relation to acoustic recordings. So here's an example of one of our recordings of the Atlantis turbine in the Pentland Firth. The spectrogram shows you in the lower panel the frequencies from 0 to 1 kilohertz. The second panel shows up to 5 kilohertz, and the upper panel up to 40 kilohertz. And this is what the turbine sounded like. This recording was taken about 7.6 meters from the turbine, and at high tide, low sea states of 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 meters per second current speed. So the signal is an amplitude modulated signal with most energy below 1 kilohertz, as you can see in the spectrogram. The peak frequencies were between 100 to 250 hertz, and we detected a secondary peak at 20 kilohertz, as you can see in the box plot of measured levels as well. Here I plotted the signal levels that we measured during flood for the peak frequencies between 100 and 250 hertz. As a function of range from the turbine, and we can see that a close range, so between 0 to 100 meters from the turbine, the mean noise levels increased by 35 to 40 dB relative to ambient noise, which is the dotted line in the graph, and up to a distance of 1 to 2 kilometers from the turbine, the ambient the mean turbine noise levels at those frequencies were higher than mean ambient noise levels. If you would like more information about this work, you can look it up in our article published last year. We are currently working to further investigate signal variability and changes in soundscape under different environmental conditions at the Pentland Firth site. We are also conducting some modeling to compare single turbines versus larger scale arrays, and to estimate ranges of audibility and potential impacts for different species groups. I would like to thank all my collaborators in the field and during data analysis, and also the funders, and wanted to particularly thank CIMIC Atlantis Energy for their support throughout these projects over the years, and without which this project would not have been possible.
Hello everyone, my name is Neda and I'm a research fellow at the University of Aberdeen, and I'll be talking to you about the use of Bayesian network techniques for modeling spatial and temporal understanding of marine ecosystem dynamics. Marine ecosystems consist of complex dynamic interactions among species in the environment, the understanding of which has significant ecological and societal implications for predicting nature's response to changes in climate and anthropogenic transformations, such as the introductions of offshore renewable energy developments. Such interactions are further exacerbated by spatial and temporal variation of the ecosystem and its components. Given the possibility of future changes, a baseline is needed to predict how ecosystems would respond to natural and anthropogenic changes. Bayesian techniques were used to find the data-driven interactions among a set of physical and biological variables and a human pressure, such as the fisheries catch, and their changes within the last 30 years within 4 contrasting regions and their associated ecosystems in the North Sea and west of Scotland. A set of physical and biological variables that will change with both climate change and the introduction of marine renewables were included that represent also critically important factors for ecosystem functioning. For example, bottom temperature, potential energy anomaly, which is an indicator of stratification and mixing rate, chlorophyll, net primary production, but also representatives of both lower and high trophic levels, such as zooplankton and fish assemblages, and top predators such as seabirds and mammals. Data-driven interactions were identified, highlighting physical variables such as bottom temperature and potential energy anomaly, but also biological variables such as sandial larvae and net primary production to be strong indicators of ecosystem change. The use of contrasting regions provided useful insights on responses linked to ecosystem disturbances and identified the top predators as better indicators for each region, with the harbor porpoise being a particularly valuable indicator of ecosystem change across most regions. Another important finding was the dramatic changes in the strength of main interactions over time. This suggests that physical and biological indicators should only be used with additional temporal information, as changes in strength led to the identification of two potentially significant periods of ecosystem change, after 2005 and after 2010, linked to physical changes in temperature and salinity, but also primary production changes. Currently, the best region-specific indicators are being used to develop what-if scenarios. For example, increase in temperature and stratification to examine species response to change in the context of climate, but also offshore renewable energy development, and under different regimes of fishing pressure. Such information will be useful to guide what habitats and species are more resilient or at risk to what type of disturbances, and therefore what management decisions are required to steer towards more ecologically sustainable conditions under the influence of future changes. Thank you for your attention.
Hi everyone, today I will present an overview of a new strategic tool to structure the cumulative impact assessment of offshore renewable energies and climate change. It will be based on a policy framework and a Bayesian habitat risk assessment model in order to provide an ecosystem approach. In the North Sea, sea surface temperatures are expected to get warmer in the red squares on the map. Longer stratification events will occur in the green ones, and oxygen concentrations will decline in the yellow ones by the end of the centuries. These changes are expected to lead to population shift at a scale of 75 kilometers up to 160 kilometer scales by 2050. What you can see on the map is that the locations of the next wind developments are overlapping with climate change affected zones. Therefore, questions are arising regarding the cumulative impact of climate change and renewable energies on ecosystem and trophic interactions. Currently, the cumulative impact assessment does not include climate change drivers, nor links between these drivers and marine populations. So in terms of policies, the cumulative effect assessment is fractions between the SEA at a regional scales and the EIA at a local one. However, the CIA should be evaluated beyond spatial and temporal boundaries of development in order to encapsulate climate change effects. The Marine Strategy Framework Directive also requires the cumulative effect assessment based on an ecosystem approach, integrating hydrologic drivers up to top-down, bottom-up trophic interactions. Consequently, any new offshore renewable development approved by the SEA or the EIA should not impact the good environmental status achievement. Therefore, linking the SEA and the EIA to the MSFD would be the first step towards a more holistic cumulative impact assessment. CIA data would be implemented into a Bayesian habitat risk assessment model in order to spatially and temporally assess cumulative effects. The Bayesian model are defined by sets of habitats and communities, coupling data from oceanic drivers up to top predator population levels. Moreover, such models are highlighting data gaps. The Bayesian model would be coupled to the habitat risk assessment one in order to quantify the cumulative risk induced by climate change and renewable energies. Such model can assess multiple stresses effect at a specific time or all year round from a 5 km up to a 250 km scales. Coupling the Bayesian model to the habitat risk assessment one will reduce uncertainties regarding key ecosystem trade-offs as well as highlighting knowledge gaps regarding data. Ultimately, this would contribute to concentrate survey and management efforts on habitat and species resiliency from a colony up to a population levels, which would provide an ecosystem approach to the CIA. I will thank you for your attention and I'll be happy to discuss any questions.
Hi, I'm Udness, PhD student at the University of Aberdeen Lighthouse Field Station, and today I'm talking from the Cromarty Firth. And behind me you can see the Nig Harbour, where there is offshore wind farm structures that will be seen in the Moray East and Sea Green offshore wind farms. As part of the strategy to reduce climate change, the wind energy industry is growing rapidly around the world to meet net zero carbon emission targets. To minimize the potential impact of offshore wind farm developments, we need to fully understand the ecological effects of these developments. So the goal of my PhD was to assess responses of marine top predators to offshore wind farm development, so the construction and operation. And for that, we used the Beatrice and Moray East offshore wind farm as case study. These two wind farms are located 15 kilometers offshore in the outer Moray Firth in northeast of Scotland. And our research focused on harbour porpoises, which is the most common cetacean species in offshore wind development sites. Porpoises left the area a few hours before the start of pile driving activities, which generate intense impulsive noise into the marine environment. We find that porpoise presence and feeding activity change in relation to vessel and construction activities throughout the wind farm development. Another aspect of my PhD focused on breeding seabirds and their distribution around jacket foundation and wind turbine structures during and after the construction. And we found that the number of large gull species, and more specifically herring gulls, increased during the construction of the wind farm. They were attracted to a jacket foundation as they use these platforms as roosting platforms. After the construction, large gull species remained in the wind farm sites, which potentially could lead to a greater risk of colliding with blades. The final part of my PhD was to investigate the prey and predator distribution at an operational wind farm sites. And we investigated whether top predators' distribution were driven by prey availability at these sites. And this pilot study will provide baseline information for future work. So what are the lessons learned? Baseline data used in environmental impact assessments are usually collected several years before the start of the construction of the wind farm. But what we find in our studies, the baseline distribution and abundance of marine top predators can change from several months, even few hours before the start of the activity. By accounting for the shift in baseline, we are able to predict more accurately how many animals remain in these sites and are disturbed or at risk from these construction activities. This shift in baseline might be even more pronounced when wind farms are being built sequentially or next to each other, as it is the case in the Moray Firth. So a change from a before-after monitoring study towards a cumulative impact assessment study might be more appropriate in some cases. The work undertaken during my PhD and at the Lighthouse Field Station has been used to develop guidance for future developments, here in Scotland but also in other parts of the world. In the future, working closely with engineers and developers at the earliest stage of the wind farm development will help design the structures so that we can deploy sensors at the structures to collect data continuously throughout the lifespan of the wind farm. And this in return will help increase the safety, as it is quite challenging to deploy equipment at sea in offshore, but it will also reduce the carbon footprint of these monitoring studies. In the future, we'll be investigating how offshore wind farm may impact the distribution and abundance of prey and their predators, mainly marine mammals and seabirds, but we will also be assessing to what extent top predator responses are driven by direct disturbance from offshore wind farm developments or indirectly through changes in prey distribution and availability that may lead potentially to consequences on the population fitness.
The Environmental Research Institute is a part of the University of the Highlands and Islands and is based in Thurso, Scotland. It has a rapidly evolving research profile with a young, highly motivated team carrying out a range of multi- and interdisciplinary work. One of its main research themes is renewable energy in the environment, with the aim being to tackle major issues surrounding the development of all renewable energy, including environmental uncertainties and concerns varying from reliability of supply, linked to climate variability and vulnerability of the resource, to fears of damage to the environment, fishing and tourism. As such, we specialise in areas including resource assessment using conventional and novel sensor platforms, ranging from drones to sonar, habitat and geophysical mapping, and studies into environmental and ecological interaction. The UK is one of several countries committed to increasing numbers of tidal turbines in its coastal waters in order to mitigate climate change. This is the same environment home to internationally important populations of diving seabirds whose breeding colonies, as you can see on this map, are often close to tidal lease sites. Negative effects such as collision, where a bird is hit by rotating blades leading to injury or mortality, and displacement, where the bird is forced out of its preferred habitat, are therefore of major concern. The question remains how to measure the occurrence of these effects, especially in the challenging environment that is areas of strong tidal currents. Fortunately, there are several established and novel methods available to measure seabird behaviour in areas of strong tidal currents, which our early career researchers use in order to find out how seabirds might be affected by tidal turbines. In the next few minutes, you'll hear from a few of our PhD researchers themselves about their work in this field, starting with myself. Hi, my name is James. I'm a PhD student whose project focuses on seabird usage of tidal stream environments in relation to fine-scale hydrodynamic features, using unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, to try and capture this. The aims of this work are to characterise hydrodynamic features, specifically colk boils, areas of large upwelling that are very present at the surface, to further knowledge with regards to seabird and hydrodynamic feature interaction to better inform environmental impact assessment, and to optimise the UAV as a survey tool for tidal stream environment. This has involved large data collection efforts within the inner sound area of the Pentland Firth, which is an active tidal lease site, and has included data collection not just from UAV surveys, but also from vessel-based observers and instrumentation. Outputs from this work have included the characterization of colk boils, finding that the probability of their presence at the surface was much more likely at faster current velocities, and that tidal phase appeared to influence their location within the sites we observed. We have also been uncovering exciting findings with regards to seabird, specifically auk species, and colk boil interactions, but there's more to come on this in a paper later this year. And now I want to pass you to Melissa, who will talk about her work focusing on vantage point survey technique.
Hi, I'm Melissa, and my work is centred around improving traditional survey methods used to assess seabird abundance and distribution, particularly the use of land-based vantage point surveys. Vantage point surveys are a widely used technique used to collect data for environmental impact assessments of seabirds. However, vantage point survey data are prone to biases due to detectability issues and the spatial resolution of data. These biases are exaggerated in tidal stream environments relevant to tidal stream energy generation. So recently, my work has compared data collected from unmanned aerial vehicle transects carried out at the same time as vantage point surveys to compare the data collected and to improve our understanding of when it may be beneficial to carry out UAV surveys alongside traditional vantage point surveys to more accurately assess seabird abundance and distribution. I'm also currently working on assessing whether two land-based observers carrying out surveys at the same time record the same number and species of seabirds to evaluate if carrying out vantage point surveys with two observers provides a more complete picture of seabird abundance and distribution. I will also be using modelling to investigate how the flux of birds on the water surface may influence the efficacy of vantage point surveys within tidal stream environments. So next up is Natalie, who will be talking about bird-borne biologging and telemetry.
Hi, I'm Natalie, and I work with bird-borne biologging and telemetry data to help determine effects of tidal energy devices on seabirds. GPS and depth recorders attached directly to seabirds tell us where they forage and dive, and consequently where they are at greatest risk of interacting with tidal turbines. My research focuses on adapting this high-resolution data for use by stakeholders and regulators in, for example, impact assessments and siting decisions. One approach I worked on is converting the raw seabird point locations to areas of high-risk behaviors such as foraging that can then be used to determine the amount of overlap with tidal lease and development sites. The workflow I've developed also accounts for the limitations of bird-borne tracking data by assessing how representative the individual areas are of the population at the colony the tracked seabird was from. I also look at how industry-relevant environmental variables such as tidal velocity and bathymetry influence seabird foraging, and whether they can be used in the prediction of dive locations. For some seabirds, such as European shag, they're able to dive to turbine depths. This is extremely relevant to assessing their risk of colliding with any turbines in the water. Next up is Nick for the underwater perspective.
Hello everyone, my name is Nicholas Pitzina, a current first year PhD student under Benjamin Williamson, and my research is using multibeam sonar to investigate changes in animal behavior around tidal stream sites. My work can be sort of split into 3 different areas. The first one is filtering, detection and tracking of multibeam data, with efforts of making it more efficient and computationally viable on many different specifications of computers. And each of those steps, of course, can be broken down into like further small little tidbits. Filtering, you're working with thresholds. Detection, do you go more from nearest neighbor approaches to kinematics based tracking? And then animal classification is the second point, and it's looking at what features can we see within the multibeam and how does the resolution of the multibeam impact what we can see. Building on that, there is what can be extracted based on those features, for example shape, size, orientation or so on, and how useful are they for stakeholders. And my last point is the implementation of machine learning, so looking how machine learning algorithms compared to manually created ones. So for example, how neural networks or you only look once, etc. are stacking up against sort of specifically created algorithms. And then also, you know, do they really help people who put in manual hours to reduce the workload? So are they in any way efficient as a person who's done that for several years?
You've now heard some of the exciting research our team of early career researchers is working on when it comes to marine wildlife and interactions with marine renewables. Please feel free to get in touch, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for listening.
Hi, I'm Laura Palmer. I'm going to be presenting research conducted by my colleagues and I at the University of St Andrews on harbour porpoise behaviour around operational tidal turbines. So there is concern that harbour porpoises and dolphins could fatally collide with tidal turbine blades. And to address this, we fit a tidal turbine in the Pentland Firth in Scotland with a series of 12 underwater microphones or hydrophones to detect porpoise echolocation clicks. This system allows us to answer several questions. Firstly, is porpoise presence in the turbine area impacted by turbine operation? Secondly, when a harbour porpoise produces an echolocation click, that sound will arrive on each hydrophone at ever so slightly different time. This allows us to triangulate the position of the porpoise. We can therefore look at how porpoises move around the turbine at close range. So firstly, is porpoise presence impacted by turbine operation? Incidentally, there were periods of time where the turbine was not operating, and this allowed us to assess changes in porpoise behaviour that's due to the turbine, whilst accounting for potentially confounding effects such as flow speed and time of year. We fit models and compared porpoise presence as a function of flow speed when the turbine was not rotating and when the turbine was rotating. And essentially the difference between these two graphs gives us the percentage change in porpoise presence which is due to turbine operation. In the bottom graph here, you can consider anywhere where the grey shaded region does not overlap with the dashed line as a significant effect. Hence, at flow speeds above 1 meters per second on the flood tide and approximately 1.7 meters per second on the ebb tide, porpoise presence was significantly reduced by turbine operation, which is indicative of avoidance behaviour. At 3 meters per second on the flood tide, this reduction was as much as 78%. As I mentioned, we could also triangulate the position of animals that were close to the turbine. Echolocation clicks from 344 porpoise detections were localised close to the turbine, and here are some examples of tracks. So on the left, there's a porpoise that appears to pass below the rotor swept area, and on the right, the porpoise appears to swim through the rotor swept area, but this is whilst the blades were stationary. None of the tracks we localised appeared to pass through when the blades were rotating. To look at this another way, these plots are of all of the clicks from all detections close to the turbine. We're viewing it as if you are facing the turbine, which is shown by the circle, and each plot shows a different distance from the blade disc. The blue dots are the localized positions of porpoise clicks when the turbine is not rotating, and the burgundy dots are when it's rotating or operating. In the middle row, we can see that regardless of whether the turbine's rotating or not, porpoises generally avoided the rotor-swept area when within 10 meters of the turbine. But they were frequently localized around the turbine base, and this is possibly due to an artificial reef effect that makes it a beneficial foraging spot for the porpoises. So what have we learned from this? Well, porpoises exhibit localized avoidance within tens to hundreds of meters of turbines, but of the individuals that are still coming into close range, they're generally showing fine-scale evasion and spending time beneath the rotor disc area. Whilst avoidance at the coarser scale is clearly beneficial from a collision risk perspective, future research will need to reconcile this with the potential negative effects of disturbance or displacement. Future research also needs to assess how porpoise behaviour is impacted as we're moving from single turbines and very small arrays to much larger commercial scale arrays. This work was a huge collaborative effort between policymakers, industry and academics, so we want to thank all of our funders and all of our collaborators. And if you want to read more, we've published much of this work with another paper hopefully to come. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Carter. I'm an ecologist working at the Sea Mammal Research Unit at the University of St Andrews. My expertise are in tracking large marine predators such as seals to understand how they use their environment, where they find food, and how human activities might affect them and shape their behaviours. Today I'm going to talk briefly about seals and wind farms and what we know about how seals interact with wind farms and what we would like to know. Firstly, a bit of background about seals. In the UK we have two species, the grey seal, which is the larger of the two at the back of the picture, and harbour seals. The UK waters are important habitat for both species, and we have a large population of the breeding numbers in Europe. As such, they are protected under various different bits of national and international legislation, and we have an obligation to monitor their populations and identify any threats they may face. So a big part of our work at SMRU is to understand where all the seals are, and we undertake regular aerial surveys and compile survey data from different data providers to sort of map out the important haul out and breeding sites for both species and count the number of animals. And this gives us an idea of their general distribution and their population trajectories. So as you can see, the North Sea is home to a large number of grey seals. That's the blue dots on the left-hand map, and also a large number of harbour seals on the right-hand map. So particularly the southern North Sea is an important area for seals, with some sites like Donanook, Blakeney Point and the Wash hosting over 1,000 individuals. In the last 20 years, we've also seen the rise of the offshore wind sector, the North Sea in particular being a site of rapid and fairly intensive development for offshore wind. If you take a look at the larger map on the left, you see the coloured polygons are wind farms that are in either operational, in planning, or at various different stages of consenting and construction. And the grey polygons are development zones that could host wind farms in the future. Just to give you an idea of the sort of scale of development we're talking about here. And if you look at the right-hand map, the southern North Sea is a particularly good area for offshore wind. It's a nice shallow substrate. The wind sort of funnels down into the channel, and it's close to the coast of many European countries for cable routes. So the blue polygons here are currently operational wind farms, although I think this map is probably a little out of date now. So what does all this development mean for seals? Well, when we change an animal's habitat, we can often result in changes to their behavior or the way they look for food or find food, and ultimately perhaps their populations. So to investigate how seals interact with wind farms, we need to use satellite tracking technologies. These electronic devices are glued to the fur on the back of the seal's neck, and they record the seal's location as well as its diving activity and haul out activity, and transmit the data to us via the mobile phone network. These tags then fall off next year when the seal molts. So over the years, we've amassed a large data set of seal tracks, and we now have seal tracking data from before, during, and after wind farm developments. And we can see what seal foraging behavior looks like. We can map where they go, and we can even build sort of predictive models of where all the seals are at sea that can be used. These maps can then be used in environmental impact assessments. So we know from these tracking data that established structures like wind farms might provide novel foraging habitat for seals. This harbour seal, for example, was tagged in the Wash in 2012, and it visited Sheringham Shoal Wind Farm on successive foraging trips over a 4-month period. And you can see from the tracks that the seal is going from turbine to turbine in a systematic grid pattern. And when we looked at the dive data, you see the seal diving to the seabed every time, which is behavior that's consistent with foraging. But this finding has led to a number of other key questions that now form part of our current and future work. So firstly, we'd like to know how prevalent is this behavior in the population? So what proportion of seals at a given haul out might be foraging at wind farms? And for those that do they also rely on foraging patches elsewhere? Next, we're also interested to know, is there any energetic benefit or cost associated with foraging at wind farms? So are seals that exhibit this kind of behaviors generally doing better off, or are they worse off than seals that forage elsewhere? Next, we'd like to know what it is about these structures that makes them good foraging habitat, and how long does it take a wind farm to become foraging habitat after construction, and what other features are important in this process? And lastly, a big question is, are wind farms hosting new populations of fish, or are the fish that are there, are they fish that would otherwise be distributed at other foraging patches? So if they're concentrated in these areas, what does this mean for competition between seals and other predators, or between individual seals? Might grey seals be better off, for example, because they're larger and more competitive than harbour seals? And how might this affect seal populations into the future? Okay, so we're currently looking into all these questions on a big collaborative project that we're doing with CFAS called the Ecosystem Level Importance of Structures as Artificial Reefs, or EcoStar, which is looking at the importance of structures in the North Sea in this context. And this is funded by the Insight programme. So stay tuned over the next couple of years for results emerging from this project. Thank you very much for listening, and that's all from me.
Great. Well, thank you very much to all the speakers there. That was great. I hope it's really given you a flavour of the breadth of environmental research that's going on across MASTS. And as I mentioned, most of the people who gave a talk there are in the meeting today. So I see a few questions that popped up in the chat. Let me just go through and see who's asked. Also, please do feel free to put your hand up if you've got any questions. Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat popping up. I've got a couple I could kick off with. I was wondering, Denise, with your talk on the acoustic modelling of the tidal turbines, I wonder if, would you be able to give us a sort of perspective of what sort of levels and frequency characteristics of the tidal turbine compared to, I guess, other anthropogenic activities that already happen in the marine environment? So what does it sound like in terms of levels and frequency characteristics?
I am not Denise. Denise had to go 6 minutes ago. After she said Ben could answer those questions. So thanks, Gordon. And I guess just to answer your question, as far as I know, like many other industrial noises, the turbines tend to be low frequency, somewhat away from the frequencies that porpoises tend to use on a day-to-day basis. So they're similar in those respects. Fundamentally, they're different in the sense that most marine noise that we're aware of is things mostly shipping. It's been where a lot of the activity are, and activities like naval sonar and so on, which are generally mobile. And tidal turbines are fundamentally fixed, but in a moving environment, which so that the whole thing's on its head, really. And so understanding how animals will respond to a fixed thing in a moving environment, a tidal stream, is somewhat challenging to understand compared to a moving thing in a fixed environment, which would be a ship moving through the sea, ferry, or whatever it is. Interestingly, in the presentation she showed just now for the Maygen turbine, as well as the frequencies associated with the meshing of the gears and the gearbox, there's also an unexpected 20 kilohertz signal, which was, as I said, unexpected and of unknown origin at this point, but very different to many other things we're aware of. And I guess the other side of that is these are all new devices, and no two tidal turbines, it turns out, are the same. There's lots and lots of brands out there in different configurations, and they, as we're discovering, sound very different to one another. So what an animal learns about a tidal turbine risk in one place may not translate to the same animal moving to another farm somewhere else.
Yeah, that's what I took from it. They definitely sounded a bit like there was some sort of characteristics that sounded a bit like a ship, but there was these funny tonal components in there as well that sounded quite unique to the turbines. I see we have a question for Joe here. There's a question here that says, will the seal tracking data be used to inform collision risk modeling for future deployment phases of Maygen and for other tidal developments? Joe?
Hi, good, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, that is the intention. There is, obviously limited data on the interactions with the actual arrays themselves, so a lot of the data is being used is actually pre-installation as well. And so we can use this information to start getting an idea of how animals might react to future installations, but we still have to bear in mind and caveat all of this work with the behavioral responses to the turbine arrays might change as array sizes increase. So in short, yes, we will intend on doing this for future array developments, but we would also aim to try and collect new and high resolution data to help us get an idea of how those collision risks might change with increasing array sizes, rather than just assume that the reactions are going to be the same as arrays start to increase in size.
Great, thanks, Joe. Are there any other questions? I've got a very quick one actually for Odd, if no one else has got any questions. It was the point that you raised about the fact that you're starting to see harbour porpoise responses before the pile driving takes place, and it's something that I think we're seeing increasingly when we're looking at behavioural responses by marine mammals to some of these activities. I just wanted to get a feel from you why you thought animals are showing responses before the pile driving started.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. So it's really an interesting question, and we found that porpoises were living around 12 hours before the start of pile driving, and this is likely to be related to increase in vessel activity and preparation work. So there may be some activities that generate higher level of noise in the environment, for instance, hunkering. And so all this preparation work probably are associated with a decrease in porpoise occurrence at these sites.
Perfect, yeah, thanks very much. And we've got one other question in the chat here. It says, in the wind industry, cumulative impact assessment usually refers to the impact of multiple wind farms rather than a single wind farm. For example, a noise experienced or a number of visible turbines. Please can you clarify what CIA means in the field of environmental science? I suspect it's different. Thanks. I'm guessing that's a question aimed at probably Morgan. or Nida. Is Nida here? And you guys
no, I'm here.
Hey.
Sorry, it just took me a bit of time to unmute myself. Yeah, so for us, I think we are defining cumulative impact assessment based on, as it says, the impact of multiple wind farms, but also we are inputting climate change effect in our definitions of climate change impact assessment, because climate change is striking at the moment and displacing animals as well. So yeah, our definition of impact assessment is multiple wind farms and climate change, since climate change is also occurring in the zones of wind farm developments. But I guess like there is plenty of definitions of climate change, of cumulative impact assessment, but yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, if there's no more questions popping up, and sort of in the effort to keep the time, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Dan Hasselman, who I'm hoping is on the call, and is going to give us a bit of an international perspective to some of the environmental science work that's going on. Dan, are you here?
Yes, I'm here, Gordon. Hi, how are you doing?
Dan, perfect, thank you. I think, do you want to share your screen? That's probably the best.
Yes, why don't I go ahead and launch my presentation, and I'll start sharing my screen. Hopefully that's coming through now. Let me know if it's not.
That's good.
You can see it? Okay, great. All right, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's quite an honor when you reach out to an international person and you decide to choose me, so thank you very much for that. As some of you might know, I'm a relative newcomer to marine renewable energy, having only been introduced to the sector in 2018. My background is actually fisheries genetics. And when I started working in the field, I thought, you know, the best way to get up to speed quickly is to dive into the literature and start to see what's going on and pull out from it what I can. One of the first papers that I came across was one by George Bollert and Andrew Gill. And I was reading through the discussion of this paper, and I came across this statement listed here. Marine renewable energy developers, regulators, scientists, engineers, and ocean stakeholders must work together to achieve the common dual objectives of clean, renewable energy and a healthy marine environment. Now, that seems like a rather simple statement on its face, but it's incredibly complex when you dig deep into it. But there's so much wisdom in this statement. And it's something that I've put forward as sort of my mantra as I go forward with marine renewables, is to reach out to the various groups that are making excellent progress in their own fields and bring them to the table to help address some of the challenges we're facing. And so this is something that I've been promoting for a long time. It's broad scale collaborations to help solve some of our challenges when it comes to addressing climate change. And so what I want to do today is just briefly talk about the importance of environmental science to marine renewable energy development. We'll talk about breaking down some of the perceived barriers to those collaborations that might exist. I'll talk very briefly about two projects that Force is undertaking with its partners. The Pathway program, which was something that I started to talk about when I visited the UK in spring of 2019, as well as the RAP program, Risk Assessment Program for Tidal Energy here in Nova Scotia, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. And then I'm going to turn a little bit towards the value of the work that you're all doing and its contributions to the global marine renewable energy development effort. So, as you all know, the ocean is a vast environment and it's a multi-user space. It provides for various industrial industries such as commercial fishing, aquaculture, shipping, oil and gas, as well as a series of recreational interests as well. And layered on top of that, of course, in some jurisdictions, you've got species of conservation concern, such as endangered North Atlantic right whale, whose loss only exacerbates the global biodiversity crisis and could destabilize ocean ecosystem functioning, as well as the inherent ecosystem services that are provided to humanity. In addition to that, you've also got indigenous communities which conduct fishing for cultural purposes and to maintain cultural relevance. So it's a multi-user space with lots of different interests. And in order to balance all of that, marine spatial planning is required to balance societal needs. and an understanding of the relative risks of marine renewable energy development in relation to those other industries and concerns is needed to secure public support for the industry and to combat climate change. And one of the biggest challenges that can exist is dialogue, establishing dialogue between interest groups with various different interests. So I've always taken the perspective that climate change is a global challenge that we're all trying to address, and so we need to bring worldwide expertise to the table. It requires participation by partners in industry, academia, regulatory agencies, as well as stakeholders to help help change. Now, this cartoon on the top left, I'm not actually a huge fan of it, only because it sets up this unfortunate relationship between us versus them, and I don't view it as us versus them at all. I think it's more along the lines of us and bridging the gaps with more people that are just like us, to have the important conversations that are needed to help facilitate commercialization of renewable energy development. And so breaking down some of these perceived barriers includes listening to each other, really listening, hearing each other's concerns to balance against others, as well as having important conversations between regulators and developers to define what monitoring goals are and the questions that need to be addressed. And then taking that information then to conversations between engineers and ecologists to make sure that engineering designs for monitoring instruments are consistent with the monitoring goals. These conversations need to happen early and need to happen frequently. It's been, in my experience, there's been a couple of times where I have seen monitoring designs from engineers not being necessarily aligned with regulatory requirements, and that can cause setbacks. And so it's important to have those conversations early and often to make sure that we're all moving together forward together in a way that's going to lead to implementation of renewable energy projects. And so breaking down some of these perceived barriers includes listening, includes building trust between project partners with the various motivations, as well as nurturing those relationships between colleagues to ensure that there's clear communications and that we're all talking the same language and we've considered each other's restrictions and that we're all cooperating. There's also some challenges, at least on my side of the world here in North America, with addressing potential conflicts of interest between partners, specifically between regulators and industry. Specifically, the challenge can be how can regulatory agencies maintain their objectivity if they're providing monitoring guidance to developers. But there's two projects that have happened fairly recently in Canada that are helping to bridge that gap. The first, which you may have heard of before, is the Pathway Program. And so when we started this project, we recognized that monitoring was on the critical path for commercialization of tidal energy in Canada. And what we needed to do was to come up with an environmental monitoring solution that would satisfy regulatory requirements for monitoring. And so the purpose of the project was to define, test, and validate an environmental effects monitoring solution. And we did this through multiple phases. First, we had a global capability assessment, which consisted of a series of reports and workshops. And here we sought international expertise in terms of how different monitoring technologies are being used in a tidal context and how they may be applied to regions in Canada, such as the MASTS Passage. Another phase of the project was advancing data processing and analysis. So we worked with partners to establish a number of algorithms for quickly processing echosounder data to post-processing, get it ready for analysis, as well as a new tool called Find Porpoises for teasing out click detections in noisy tidal environments. And then a third phase of the project was technology validation. And so here we had a series of field projects focused on understanding which technologies are beneficial for use in the MASTS Passage and where they ought to be mounted. So we had a series of projects for passive acoustic monitoring, series of projects for imaging sonars, as well as a series of projects for echo sounders. And for each of these projects, we come up with an initial project concept, which then fed into an initial study design. That study design then went to the subject matter expert that was involved in the phase 1 study of the program. And through an iterative process, we refined the methodology. We integrated the regulator into this process by then sending out this refined methodology to them for their constructive feedback. And even though the regulator here in Canada doesn't like to get directly involved in advising developers directly in terms of monitoring, they were willing to contribute towards this process because they understood the inherent value of what it brings to moving forward the entire sector. After getting regulatory feedback, we finalized the study design and then did the implementation of the research itself. And the picture on the right-hand side is basically one of Force's FAST platforms. FAST stands for Funny Advanced Sensor Technology. And it's outkitted with a series of monitoring instruments that DP Energy is put into the platform and stemming from the results of the program. So this was a project that was only possible through broad collaborations with a variety of different agencies here in Canada, but also individuals abroad. This included work between Force and OERA at the project management level. It involved various people such as Benjamin Williamson, Louise McGarry, James Jocelyn, and David Barkley feeding into refining study designs, as well as Fisheries Oceans Canada contributing towards that. And then a series of partners helping to execute these study designs in the field, or in the case of algorithm development, working in their laboratories to help push the envelope in terms of what we can do with raw data. Now, another project that we've recently undertaken at Force is the risk assessment program. And this project is designed to help develop encounter rate models for fish in the Minas Passage. The foundation for this work is the recognition that hydroacoustics play a large role in terms of, sorry, not hydroacoustics, but hydrodynamics play a large role in terms of understanding which portions of tidal channels fish are likely to use during different portions of the tidal phase. Well, they may be found in certain areas during an ebb tide. They may move and be aggregated with certain other vortices and eddies during the flood tide. And so we've got a tremendous amount of tagging data provided to the project by the Ocean Tracking Network. They reached out to 22 different data contributors, and those contributors agreed to allow access to the tracking data to help us provide species distribution maps for 9 fishes in the Minas Passage. And that covers everything from small planktivorous fish such as alewife, pictured here, all the way up to white shark, which are an endangered species here in Canada. And surprisingly, we find a great number of white sharks in the Minas Passage, much more than we would have thought before. And that information is only coming forward because of the tracking data we have access to. Ultimately, what we're doing is developing the species distribution models, linking species distributions to environmental features related to the hydrodynamics of the system, and then using that information to project where we think certain fish are going to be during certain periods of time during the year. And then layered on top of that, we've got our tagging program, which is then being used to help validate the encounter rate model predictions, basically. So that sort of outlines the process here. Ultimately, what we're looking to do is to provide a tool that supports science-based decision-making for the tidal energy sector in Canada in Minas Passage throughout project life cycles. And again, this is another project that had broad collaboration from a variety of different contributors. The project team is made up of Force, our First Nations partner, the Mi'kmaq Conservation Group, Ocean Tracking Network, Marine Renewables Canada, as well as Acadia University. And then we're getting project support from a variety of different groups, such as local fishers, the 22 data contributors for the 9 species I mentioned, regulatory agencies involved, as well as other academic partners. So that's just a high-level overview of some of the recent work we've been digging into. And each of those projects themselves is easily a 45-minute presentation if we really wanted to dig deep. I don't have time for that today. But when I look across at what's being done in Scotland, I'm not pandering when it says I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. It's very clear that the work that's being done in the UK has really served to push the international understanding of what environmental effects are. Clearly, the work you've been doing is of great benefit to the global effort to develop the renewable energy sector as well to combat climate change. The UK and Scotland in particular has a long history of renewable energy development as well as leadership. We've established test centers as well as collaborations between industry, regulators, and academic institutions that are helping to further the work, and you can see that by all the presentations given today. And it highlights that you guys have established a pipeline of skilled personnel development through university programs to build capacity for the sector. One doesn't have to go back very far or look very hard to find relevant pieces of primary publications that are coming out that attest to this fact that you have a strong group of people coming up that are only going to serve to advance this on a global level. There's lots of opportunities for data and study transferability to other regions. So for instance, I think about things like data transferability of what's been done in the UK to Canada. The regulator in my neck of the woods could be a little hesitant to accept things on face value, but I think they'd be willing to accept redoing some of the studies in our local environments to help understand whether or not we see similar effects. Our regulator often refers to MASTS passage as a unique environment, and there is some validity to that, but I don't think that negates all the great work that's being done in the UK and its transferability of the lessons learned to what the situation we're dealing with over here. My overall view is that international collaborations will strengthen the global development of the renewable energy sector and secure public support. And the work you're doing is helping to drive that in a major way. So with that, thank you very much. And if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Many thanks, Dan. That was a great talk and a great summary of what's going on over in Canada. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. Anyone got any questions for Dan? I've got one very quick one if nobody's jumping in. It's really about the sort of the general public perception of tidal energy over your way. What does the sort of normal person on the street think of tidal energy? Are they even aware of what's going on over in Fundy?
Yes, generally they are. Back 5 or 6 years ago, there was an unfortunate billboard that was posted here in Halifax that had a picture of the Cape Shark turbine, and the caption was "Grinding Nemo." Now, of course, that's fear mongering, and it doesn't at all reflect the reality of what's going on with tidal energy. But it's that kind of perception that can cement itself in the public mind, and battling that perception can be challenging. Generally, though, we are finding that as we're conducting research and as we're reaching out to our partners, the tide is shifting. Let's say that. We are broadly getting more and more support for what we're doing, but there is always this component of the population that needs to be engaged with more actively to help quell fears, and that is best done through data-driven research and providing information. And so engagement is a huge part of conveying the reality of tidal energy development and quelling fears.
Yeah, great. Thanks. I mean, do you feel there's a sort of, is there a sort of approach to try and give people local ownership of, not necessarily the actual companies, but it's a local ownership of what's going on in their local environment when it comes to tidal energy?
Yeah, there is to an extent. So for instance, one of Force's monitoring programs is a lobster-based program. And we have it going on this fall once again. And to help do that, we are engaging with a local fisher to actually have him on board the vessel, helping to work with the lobsters themselves, capturing, measuring, tagging, and releasing. And so, public science, citizen science, that really can actually really help out in terms of getting people on the ground and engaged in the effort itself. And people generally, I find, want to be part of a solution. And if you can find ways to bring them to the table, they're more than willing to help.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Dan. If there's no other questions, I think we should move on to a few last words from Ben Wilson, who's going to give us a bit of a summary. Ben, are you still here?
Yes, I'm here. If Dan can stop sharing,
yes,
lovely picture. Okay, doke. Some final words. So I guess the brief that Gordon gave me was, I made some notes while I've been typing away while we're going. Where are we with environment? Where are we with science and engineering and the development of marine renewable energy in Scotland? I'll change my brief a bit in the sense that most of what we've been talking about is environmental science and engineering, and I think it's a really interesting area of interaction, and certainly one that's evolved in the Scottish marine research community in the last few years, evolved very much for the better. Right, so the positives, we've heard at the beginning of this presentation, beginning of this session, from Marianne Miller about the MASTS community and the Marine Renewable Energy Forum. And researchers in the last few years have become, across Scotland, very joined up thanks to MASTS and the other pooling initiatives. So we've got a good understanding of what each other are doing and who we are. And the forum has been quite helpful in that respect. And another positive is that marine renewables and let's just say offshore renewable energy, that's wind, wave and tide, tends to go into scientifically interesting habitats, and also habitats that haven't been studied much in the past because they're so technically difficult to work in. However, we're understanding that they're ecologically interesting places, particularly places like tidal stream environments and so on. And we heard in Joe's talk about how seals were using the 3D environment of moving water, so-called hydrospace, which is very interesting for researchers. So there's a straight out positive in the coincidence of ecologists being interested in the environments that these industries are going into. We heard from Jared earlier on about the one-stop shop that Marine Scotland are offering and things like ScotMer, key knowledge gaps and evidence maps and these kinds of integrative attitudes, and Marine Scotland being very much a place where regulators, where the regulations are talking to industry and also commissioning, feeding through to the science that needs to be done. So that's been very helpful for Scottish scientists getting involved. I mentioned ScotMer, also Marine Scotland science supporting broad-scale surveying, which has been very good for underpinning a lot of the sorts of work we do, but also linking to previous efforts like SCANS, the big international marine mammal surveys, Crown Estate, seabird surveys, and so on. So we've got quite a good and evolving picture of the marine environment around Scotland. It could be better, but it's definitely getting there. Another factor that's positive is the philosophy in Scotland that's been in operation for the last few years of survey, deploy, and monitor, allowing companies to put devices in, such as the Maygen that we heard about several times here, devices into the sea and monitor them and see what their effect is before building out more widely. Other countries have not been able to do that, where they've been stuck in a sort of catch-22. So that approach in Scotland has been very useful globally, and has meant the industry, particularly the wave and tide sectors, can move forward when there's very little information. In terms of Scotland, wave and tide, because of things like the survey and deploy and monitor strategy, global companies have focused on Scotland. That's changed a little bit more recently, but that helped Scotland get ahead of step ahead. Offshore wind has been established industries elsewhere, but have been moving into the UK in a big way. So and joining established research communities that can answer some of the questions needed for those developments. So I've said some things about the positives. In terms of challenges, offshore renewable energy goes into, well, by definition, difficult environments. There's lots of energy around the difficult places to work. And as Dan was saying just now, they vary from one site to another one. Different things are happening, and we've been learning a lot about those. A big challenge is that engineers and ecologists don't speak the same language. And in the last few years, ecologists that have been getting involved in renewables have learned a lot of things that they never thought they'd be learning, meshing frequencies of gearboxes all the way through to how big companies work in terms of risk and so on. Another challenge has been the engineering of offshore renewables is changing in itself. There's been a couple of mentions of EMEC, the wave and tidal test site. Great place to go and do environmental research, but one of the problems is the companies in there testing their own devices. They've got really high stakes in what they're doing, not necessarily very interested in the environmental risks associated with you doing research around their devices, because their test devices and the whole companies are riding on their success. So that engineering is evolving, and that's the challenge for us trying to answer environmental questions. Another one that Ord mentioned was the timelines of companies and changing baselines. Companies are changing what they're doing because of lots of factors, and in monitoring that might have gone on might become out of date by the time a development actually happens. Just going back to that environment, sort of company priorities, environmental science is quite difficult sometimes when you want to engage with a company to, say, pop a sensor onto one of their devices. If it's in the scene, it's been signed off by the construction engineers and so on. You can't just weld an extra wee sensor onto something like an offshore jacket or something like that. So that's very challenging, comes as a bit of a surprise to ecologists that tend to be more used to winging things on smaller budgets and so on. And in terms of budgeting, we've learned a lot about how companies, large engineering companies, deal with their budgeting, and it's very different to the sort of budgeting that most ecological research is done on, both in size and also in timeframes. Again, different health and safety philosophies between scientists and engineering companies and so on. And that varies, we found, between companies as well. So they have their own philosophies, so that's a big challenge. Dan's I don't need to repeat, Dan's said a lot about communication and trust amongst stakeholders, interest groups, and also some of the issues about local resistance. And we've said a lot about ecology here, and ecological science or environmental science. There's also big space for social science, and also the law got mentioned usefully in the comments as well. Just focusing on Scotland for a second, I think globally, Scotland for a while was a real focus for wave and tidal developments, and it was interesting to see DP energy and sustainable marine energy, and Benjamin Williamson mentioned in Dan's talk just now, a lot of interchange of names we're all familiar with on the Scottish side of things. Wind's been more mixed in terms of these are already global companies coming into Scotland to develop, but have landed in established research communities, as we've just heard. And very nice to hear that Dan recognises they're standing on the shoulder of giants. And I guess just thinking back from a Scottish perspective, a lot of this has been pieced together in all sorts of different ways. It may look coherent from the outside, but on the inside, there's been a huge amount of challenge pulling all this expertise and learning together, from small projects winging it through to large consortia. Where do we need to go? I think the drivers for renewable energy have just gone up several notches in the last couple of years. I mean, even the discussion about gas this morning, you realise that energy is a huge issue. And from the pictures that Jared and Matt showed with the leasing rounds, both in Scotland and across Europe, we realise that these are massive developments coming our way, whether we like it or not. Tidal stream, well, that mostly in relation to wind. Tidal stream is expanded internationally, and we've learnt a lot about there's common issues, collision being one, globally, but with international or local twists to what's important and needs knowing. And also these issues, which hasn't been mentioned today, was this idea of retiring risk, which suits some countries in terms of being able to move forward and may not be more appropriate elsewhere. Just moving forward, where we need to go, we've learned a lot about individual species interactions, collisions being one, and we've started to move into understanding cumulative impacts. Morgan talked about that a minute ago. And those cumulative impacts could be the same industry many times, or it could be multiple industries impacting on individuals. And I think I really welcome that the idea that we've put a lot of effort into EIAs for individual developments and individual species or groups of species or individual sites, but we really need to move that sort of effort up into the SEA level as these industries start becoming kind of basin-wide in their scale. And then we move, of course, into ecosystem interactions, which Nadia talked about. But on top of all of that, the whole environment is being changed by climate. So we've got that shifting baseline of climate going on. And I think one of the other areas that's not been explored yet, and we may well move into that area, is the knock-on impacts. One species will be impacted by a species, one interaction between the species and the device, but how does that impact its prey or another species that eats that species? So that's an area things need to be going. So just to kind of summarize, we've learned a huge amount. I've been involved in this area since 2006, and in those years, things have moved a lot. We've learned a lot about the habitats who developed tools. James, Melissa, Natalie, and Nick talked about the kinds of tools. We've learned about new habitats, the squiggly seals that Matt was talking about, going off feeding around the baselines of wind turbines. That's a new habitat with interactions. I guess the other one is we've learned a lot about the interactions themselves. Do they really happen? So Laura was talking about porpoises and tidal turbines and getting a better idea, which helps understand the magnitude of the problems, and then linking into things like what mitigation could be had. And mitigation obviously comes with economic costs, and that's when we get to the sharp end of the industry. Pile driving mitigation is something that there's a potential solution, but it's costly, and how does that cut in to the regulations and financial models of companies? So good things are happening. I think it's been fantastic to see all these presentations pulled together and see where we're going. It's a really exciting piece of science to help a developing and very necessary set of industries. But we have huge challenges, and we should keep our foot on the gas, carbon-free gas, that is. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. That was great. It really just leaves me to say, first of all, thanks to you all for dialing into the webinar. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. And a special thanks to everyone who either provided a recorded talk or spoke live today. We had some great presentations there. And also thanks to Sarah in the background who kept things running smoothly. I'd encourage you all to have a look at the MASTS website if you're interested in finding a bit more about the MASTS research that's going on. And I'd also encourage you to have a look at some of the future EDP webinars that are being held in the lead up to COP26. So yeah, thanks again for dialing in. And yeah, great, thank you.